Alright, so in keeping with this horror theme, it was only a matter of time before we got to the whole battling personalities scenario, whether it be all inside one body, or if one should break out and become its own thing. Also, coming from two interesting, but also extremely identifiable points of view, with one being just straight up De Palma, and the other being another combination of George Romero and Stephen King, which we got with something entirely different before this with Creepshow. But this was another kind of totally interesting and different collaboration. Maybe not interesting in the sense of exactly what all the movie goes into. It may fall flat a little in that category, but in regards to them having done like a big anthology thing that King basically wrote specifically as a movie, and then to go into one of his adaptations, but that being this one, just all kind of is an interesting series of events to lead up to that. But before we go into all that, I think I actually want to start with Raising Cain, where I think for most people, especially with De Palma on the thrillers like this, it was a couple. It took at least a couple of viewings for me to really sort of see the beauty in Raising Cain. Obviously, that first time around is always going to be a bit. You're not quite sure, and it goes in some certain sketchy directions to where it's like, does he really know what he's trying to do here, genre-wise, or any of that? But then, once you become more familiar, because I saw this way early before I saw much of other De Palma's other stuff, so I wasn't aware of the fact that that's pretty much his forte, is to just fuck with genres, just just all over the place intentionally. And this movie is a perfect example of that, which I think is why it might be so off-putting, maybe the first or second time you see it, before you really get a chance to fall in love with it and see what it's doing. But talking about seeing it for like that first time point of view, the opening itself might seem a bit confusing in regards to how exactly Cain falls into this, because if you don't really know what the setup is, you actually might think for a little bit, or at least for the first scene, that Cain is his actual own person. When they throw interesting little like context clues in there to make it seem almost like you can believe that if you don't know exactly what the setup is. Like when he first appears, you immediately think, oh well, obviously it's another one of his personalities. He's not actually there. This is just something that the Lithgow character is seeing. But he says something on the lines. He mentions the term twin brothers, so that might immediately throw off somebody seeing this for the first time. And then just these little things, because obviously just the way he just happens to appear in this moment shows off that he's, just another personality. But he also says something on the lines of, why have you been following me? As if it's... They throw in these things that almost make it believable that he's an entirely separate person. And Cain saying stuff like, I've got to change out of these clothes, something that a hallucination would never do, like physically. And they actually play with this a few times in the beginning here before you really get a grasp on it, but I'll go into that when we get there. The other thing that's going on here is this whole side plot involving his marriage to Leah Davidovich and her affair with Stephen Bauer. And the interesting thing here is, but before we go into that in general, it's worth it to look into. Apparently the Blu-ray, I think Blu-ray that was released a couple of years ago finally brought these to light. But the fact that De Palma had originally had this movie in like an entirely different order, in the way he revealed things, and it was going to be, I think, like the first 25 minutes or so was going to be just her story and her affair with Stephen Bauer, and the lead into that, like the whole backstory of his wife dying of cancer and her being there and all that. And then it was going to be like her building up that she thinks something is wrong with Carter, but she's not sure what. And then after we've gotten like this whole 20 to 25 minute opening of just their romance, the movie throws you a curveball, and then we get the scene where we see what Carter does exactly with the moms on the playground, and then Cain's whole existence and all that other stuff. And it was sort of meant to be this whole sort of luring you in with like this sort of soap opera romance type thing. And then just hitting you in the face with this really twisted plot about her husband. But eventually, before it was released, he decided to just do it in more or less chronological order, with just some flashbacks filling in the blanks for her. and also just making sure he didn't really lose his audience, who were go into it and think they're going to get some kind of, you know, thriller about the whole split personality thing. And like the entire first third of it, because it's only an hour and a half, so that would have been the entire first third of it. It's just this affair thing. So you see where he's coming from, but at the same time, and I believe the other version, like fully intact, is on the Blu-ray as well. So I haven't seen it that way yet, but I am really intrigued just to see how the flow goes. But I can definitely see where that would work and where that would pay off in regards to just really throwing the audience off. But I do think it also works quite well as is, even if it might seem... It almost seems like it might seem a bit cleaner the other way, to where this almost might seem a bit sloppy and like it's kind of all over the place how we introduce the Cain thing and then we kind of get her whole thing, but there is something still here that I think absolutely fits with what she's doing, because there's, well, first off, there's the whole thing when we go, the very opening, after he goes home, after we've seen what he does to, like, mothers and their children, he's, one of the children he's just brought home with him because they have nowhere else to go, and there's this whole sequence where, like, obviously, in most movies, marriages, especially if they've been going on for a while, tend to be depicted as, like, something square, or something very uneventful, and certainly something sexless. So there's this particular moment when he's still clearly, like, Cain in this moment, and he climbs into bed with her, and there's a couple of things here. For starters, it shows, like, sort of the contrast of just they seemingly have this normal loving marriage when she's with Carter, but then there's almost like that De Palma sleaze is coming in as this almost sex scene happens. But then there's also sort of like, it's almost kind of symbolic of what she's doing or what she's about to do when it's when we see that she thinks he's Carter in this moment when he's actually Cain, and it's like her basically being in bed with another dude. It's like it's some sort of foreshadowing to what she's actually doing, even though she's in bed physically with her husband. I always find that kind of interesting. I'm not sure if it was intentional or not, but regardless, I think it works really well. And then there's like this whole sort of, where we were talking about the fact that when she started this affair with him, Stephen Bauer's character, was when his wife was dying of cancer, and she, like, sees this happen just before she dies, and it sort of gives her, like, this own sort of wicked double life, also, that's sort of depicted in a much creepier way, in, like, these weird dream sequences that she has, that at first seem a bit, I guess, superfluous, but there is something here that's, like, really tone-setting, and really is going into that whole thing of, it feels like both of them kind of have that double personality, just hers is much more, she's in much more control of, for sure, but they both kind of have this double life going on that makes her not just the distressed wife character, which I find really interesting. It's almost like, in a certain roundabout way, it's almost like she's kind of an equal in regards to how having things to hide and having sides of herself to hide and stuff like that, so I really like that. And then, of course, this eventually leads to one of the De Palma's other big, gigantic trademarks, which is his Hitchcock references, which seem like almost non-stop in many of his movies. And here, we're definitely, Psycho especially, just all the time. And we get this whole scene that's basically like an exact recreation of him pushing the car with Marion Crane in it into the pond or whatever, waiting for it to sink. And it has its own sort of... that's the thing, too, is you would think it'd be frustrating if a director just kind of constantly referenced another director, to the point that it's such a famous director with so many famous techniques, you can tell when it's happening. There's nothing particularly subtle about it, but the way that De Palma uses those, but they're always in, like, the context of his own thing, to where it doesn't feel like he's just sort of blatantly ripping off. He finds the way to where you can immediately identify the Hitchcock reference, but it's still kind of his own thing, too, in the moment, because there'll be, like, just one more little twist to it or something. So that's really skillfully done, also. And I guess if you want to continue the Psycho comparisons, it's eventually going to get to a point, obviously, especially in movies like this, it always happens, where we really have no choice but to somewhere in the middle have an exposition dump. Obviously in Psycho it was at the end, but here we get the woman that used to work for his father that comes in and basically says everything that's going on. But once again, He has his way of putting his own little twists on this, almost to the point where it's like he's doing a bit of a satire of them or something. So we have this really incredible long take where they just walk around, they go up and down the stairs, they get into the elevator, they go down, they get out of the elevator, all while this exposition's happening, with these little funny moments where she's almost seemingly getting lost and they have to keep guiding her. And even in this moment also, there's like a bit of foreshadowing that seems to go by where she has to wear a wig. And she says something on the lines of, "I hate this wig, it makes me look like a transvestite." And it's like, obviously, not only does that foreshadow what is to come with Carter's character when Margot starts to come out, but also it sort of feels like it's similar territory to, welcome similar territory to like when De Palma did Dressed to Kill. Which of course brings us full circle back to it's just one big old gigantic Psycho reference. But once again, as I said, still feels like his entirely own thing as well, and it feels like foreshadowing within the movie in itself as opposed to coming from anywhere else outside of this particular story, which is really nice. And then obviously once we get to this point is when the other personalities start to come out, is when Lithgow's performance really gets to take off. And that's saying something, because he's already done a lot up to this point, because obviously Carter and Cain, he does a fantastic job of just showing the polar opposites that they are, where Carter's the sort of Lithgow character, so he's sort of the character that we come to expect from Lithgow in other movies. Cain is the Lithgow performance we expect from De Palma movies, like when they did Blowout together. And then the fact that these have to converge and then add all these other personalities on top of the fact that he's also playing his father, which is also like a totally different personality in this, is just really well done. And this is also where, like, when I talked about how De Palma loves playing with his genres, and it's like that in itself is just personified in this one scene where Lithgow's bouncing around the different personalities. Because you've sort of got, like, this... like, when he's doing Cain, there's obviously a thriller aspect, but there's something sort of, like, loose and fun about it, as threatening of a character as he is. There's still just sort of, like, a fun quality to it. And then when he goes into Josh, the child, it's like there's this almost sort of absurdity to where you're not quite sure if we're going into comedy territory or not, but he walks that line just enough between funny and just weird. And finds sort of that perfect pitch. And then with Margot, there's like something just entirely darker. Like Cain, but only going far beyond into this sort of unknown, mysterious territory that's never quite revealed to us, but revealed to us just enough that we know how threatening it is. Which is really well done. So, one of the interesting things here that I was talking about before, when we're first introduced to Cain, and it's like it's almost, you could almost be tricked into thinking he's actually there if you haven't seen the movie before or don't know the concept. But then you have these moments when, like the scenes with his father, especially since we're already kind of, you know, juggling here a little bit by... Cain in this moment is the one talking to the father, but he's dressed as Carter, basically pretending to be Carter, had been pretending to be Carter at this point. So when he meets the father, and the fact that he's also played by Lithgow, your immediate thought, especially since it's been shown that, or been told to us that his father's supposedly dead, he committed suicide, the fact that you just immediately assume his father's just another personality. With all these different segments playing that up. And then it's like... And this continues similarly when he has supposedly killed his wife, and she comes back. And when we see her on the monitor, and it's almost like... We don't really believe that she's there at first, because it's like... That could just be some jump scare hallucination to show like his guilt and paranoia and stuff like that. And then it turns out she's actually there. And so it's like this sort of balance where it's like, the first time we see Cain, it's like what seems real is actually fake and not there. But then when we see his wife come back, or we see his father, it's like what we automatically assume is fake is actually real. And the fact that he can just keep making us think things and then taking us in the opposite direction from both sides is just really well done and like really disorienting in the best way. And it's very easy to see why this movie doesn't particularly catch on for a lot of people after their first viewing. But just really getting to soak in all this stuff with multiple viewings is great. And the fact that it's short helps that a lot, so it's easy to watch like multiple times over. So, yeah, there's, like I said, very simple, and it could have been a very sort of simple thriller approach, but the way he plays with the genres and the timelines and all that stuff, and just really, really puts his De Palma touch on it, just make it something that's really, yeah, just, like, it's not just that you want to watch it over and over again to really soak it in, but the fact that the movie makes that so easy to do, because a lot of movies tend to, if you watch them over and over again, you can get easily burnt out on. Because this movie has so much to offer, you can just sort of keep revisiting it and keep finding that stuff and just really, yeah, just really sink into it. It is worth noting when you watch it nowadays, especially over the past couple of years or so. When we talked about Split when it came out, Shyamalan's movie, we may have mentioned Raising Cain once or twice just in passing, like, oh yeah, it's similar. But when you go back and watch Raising Cain now, it's like, I almost feel like De Palma could sue him. Like, it is crazy how much of Raising Cain is in Split, and I had never really realized it the first time I saw Split, but it's kind of like really hard to ignore now, but yeah, I feel like Shyamalan really, really owes De Palma something for that movie. Good as it is on its own, it's just, it's really kind of in the shadow when you really look at them both together and see just how much one is in the other. And lastly, not to mention, it's just got one of the very best taglines in movie history. Demented, deranged, deceitful, De Palma. That's... you can't really get better than that. So that's pretty much how I feel about that. The Dark Half doesn't have near as much to sink your teeth into. It is sort of much more basic and straightforward, which is kind of one of its major setbacks, because the setup itself seems like it's really going against that kind of thing, and it feels like it has so much in concept to offer, but there's only so many directions that it ends up going. Because, as I said, it's the reteaming of Romero and King, which is a very interesting combination. Like I said, you would think you'd get something a bit more creative like Creepshow. It's interesting they go to something that's a bit more as straightforward as this is. But, obviously, our main character is Timothy Hutton, who is a writer, Thad Beaumont, which is interesting because obviously a lot of King's protagonists are writers, and it's always really interesting. I always find it interesting, even if it's something that's sort of overplayed by him. I still think it's interesting to sort of see the writer's perspective from him through one of his fictional characters. And it's funny to me that most of them usually end up being the antagonists of the story, or some sort of threat. And in this case, that's also pretty much what's going on. So, obviously, there's not a whole lot in regards to, like, being symbolic or anything. Everything's pretty much right on the nose in regards to what we're doing here. Where we have, like, one of Hutton's first scenes is him giving a class lecture where he's talking about, we are all basically two different human beings and stuff like that. And it's like, it's just laying everything out right away. It's like the exposition we talked about, but, like, right at the front, and I can't tell if they think they're being subtle or not. I would say with these two, probably not, but it's hard to tell. But and then we see how he has this other sort of writing personality, much like King himself did with the Richard Bachman name. But here, obviously, Thad is going to be the very safe writer that doesn't do anything particularly interesting, and doesn't really find success with that. So his alternate name with George Stark is the one that just gets to really go off and write the really, really crazy shit that sells a whole bunch of stuff. I think even his agent or somebody says, I read George Stark because it's fun, and I read Thad Beaumont because it's my job. Which pretty much lays out exactly the divide in character here. So, obviously, he had, like this, I believe, this book, the book that this is based on, is, like, dedicated to the memory of Richard Bachman, because he, like, killed off his, pen name from before. And so he decided he was going to do that in this story quite literally, by having him, like, have George Stark killed, have a tombstone and all that, just really, really go all literal with it. Just even the moment when, once they're putting it all together, Digger in the background is like crossing his chest. So just a detail like that is nice. On top of the sort of when it tries to get crazier, you see those little details sort of that are just in there, and that's sort of where the movie kind of hits some nice high spots that it really should have been doing more of, like when they go to the crime scene of the guy that was going to blackmail him, and the landlady comes in with the cops, and the cops, who have probably seen shit like this on a daily basis or whatever, they turn away and they like gag when they see the body, and the landlady's just kind of looking almost like satisfied, which is this really weird thing. And then it could have used more weird touches like that, because when you look at the first scene, one of the first scenes, and it sort of sets up what's going on here in this roundabout way, where he's having the migraines and the headaches and all that, so he goes and he has the brain surgery, and they find the fucking eyeball in there that's moving. And it's like, because that's like the opening scene, you sort of expect something, especially from the combination of Romero and King, you expect something significantly more crazy than we actually get. And it's like, this is like the first scene just really promises that, and then we only get just tiny little portions of where that craziness could have gone. But overall, it eventually just sort of turns into another slasher movie, where obviously it does get a bit, it sort of goes in that cliche territory of having the dark side of yourself, where he's all dressed in black, and he's got the boots and the slick back hair and the knife and shit. But the thing here is that there is something here about the way they introduce it, like the nightmare scene. The first time we kind of get a glimpse of them in the same room, but it's like, it's only from below, it's like from the knee down, and we see like George walk into the frame with just, Thad and just his normal get-up, like his dad shoes and all that. And then George walks into this frame, and we really get this vibe that, like, there is a real threat to Thad with the arrival of this other side of him. But little do we realize just how literal they're going with this when we see this scene. So it's revealed relatively early that he's also played by Timothy Hutton, and he just happens to be this other completely separate being that happens to exist, that's just living out Thad's dark side. And then he's just a serial killer, and that's pretty much what the rest of the movie is. Not that there's not something entertaining here. I've seen this movie a few times, and I wasn't forced any of those times. But the thing here is, I do think they could have had more fun with, like, the ambiguity of it, and been, like, stretch that out a little longer, like, the way he blacks out while he's writing thing and then doesn't remember stuff, and it's like, and the fact that the first couple of kills George does, they obscure his face, like it's gonna be some mystery before it's revealed pretty early that it's him, like it's, like a carbon copy of him, just a badder version or whatever. But the thing here is that they could have built up a little more, I think, that maybe it was him. Because they play with that a little bit with like the whole blacking out thing, but the only problem here is that even if whether you know the concept or not going in, it's like, it never seems likely that it's Thad doing this, when it probably should feel like that, at least for a little bit. But then there's also some stuff that's as surprisingly literal as it is, there's still some stuff that seems a bit too ambiguous, like how George came to be in a physical form, like entirely, now exactly how he came to be, and because that's the thing is, I'm not sure what all the book goes into, I didn't read it, but the whole thing about if we were to get an explanation, just like right up exactly how George came to be an entire being all his own, like obviously things are suggested and alluded to, but if we just got like a full-on explanation of how this came to be, it would probably be underwhelming. So there's like it would probably be a lose-lose, so it may be better, but really the point here is that it always leaves you wondering that. And I think in a tighter movie, that's not something that would cross your mind too much, or it would cross your mind once, but you wouldn't care enough, because the rest of the movie is doing so many more other interesting things, is that you wouldn't be thinking about that. But because the movie is pretty much a slasher movie in the last hour and a half or so, it leaves you to wonder more about that kind of stuff, the more crazy stuff that they could have done, but they just kind of gloss over in order to go the more routine route. If there is an interesting choice this movie makes, this is probably one of the most interesting choices this movie makes, is the fact that Michael Rooker is in it, playing the good guy, and he stays the good guy. He is the cop that is just looking after the situation, does his very best to believe that, and tries to figure out what's going on so that he can prove his innocence. And it's like really refreshing to see that, and he's obviously known for, like, you know, Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer and all the other villains he's played and all the other killers he's played, or shady people just in general. And it's like really refreshing how good he is as a good guy. So I always found that just his whole presence here is just something really interesting and refreshing that I'd actually like to see him do a bit more. Because it turns out he can. And then we also have the presence of, like, Julie Harris here, who sort of, like, if you immediately associate, she's obviously got a whole, you know, she's got The Member of the Wedding and a whole bunch of movies in her past filmography, but if you, like, immediately associate her with The Haunting, that sort of adds an interesting presence to her being in a movie like this, where you just sort of instantly associate her with that kind of material. But she does have, I mean, one of her, like, main scenes towards the end basically is just to show off how rushed the movie's getting in its climax. Because there is, like, it starts to feel a bit sloppier as it's going towards the end, where we have, Thad's getting in the car and he's getting ready to drive off to save his family, because we're doing that whole thing, that whole cliche. And she's doing this thing that she's saying these things that should be, like, really creepy, and working really well and effective, where she's, like, looking up at the sky and she's saying stuff like, I guess God's on sabbatical or something like that. But it's like she's talking to him, and he, like, is not even listening to her. He's already, when she's, like, saying these things, these creepy things, he's already in his car with the door shut, and there's no way she can hear this, and he can hear that. And it even gets to a point where it's like, he's driving off, there's no way he can hear her, and she says, like, wear a red carnation so I know it's you when you get back, and he's, like, already down the road. And the movie ends before we even see the next day, so it's like, we don't even know if that even came to be. So that all kind of felt rushed and sloppy a little bit, and then, of course, we get to our big climax where they just fight each other. Which, honestly, is in a way satisfying. I mean, there's a part of you, no matter how ambiguous it gets, or how metaphorical it gets, or whatever, or symbolic, a part of you just kind of wants to see them fight, just to see what it is, and to sort of see how they would do that technically, where it's two Timothy Huttons beating the shit out of each other. And they cut it surprisingly well. It could look like really fake, you could see, like, the obvious doubles and all that, but it actually looks fine. And then, obviously, this is all sort of crescendos in this big, nice, gory scene of George's death, where the birds we've been building up the whole movie that somehow associate with him, yet he doesn't really know they exist. Whatever the hell that... Another one of those things that they really could have gone a lot more into that they just kind of don't. And like I said, in another movie, I'd probably really appreciate the ambiguity and the stuff that just goes unexplained. Because, like, King is, like, could be really good about that stuff, where he's... Obviously, a lot of stuff probably gets over-explained, but there's some stuff in where it's like, it's best left with just no explanation, and that's why it works. But this one is just like I said, if the movie had been more interesting and the other aspects that it explored, I probably wouldn't even be thinking about that. But because the movie is just sort of as basic as it is, I'm wondering about all these things we don't really get much of a look into. So that's unfortunate, but there's like a guilty pleasure in here somewhere for sure. I don't even know if I feel guilty about it. Maybe I just like it. So, but I mean, it hardly lives up when you're comparing it to something like Raising Cain, that just has all these different layers to it, and the way it plays with everything, and just really takes its audience and just... It's the exact opposite of what The Dark Half does. It lets its audience just sort of relish in everything and all the different ideas and how it's laid out in all these different ways. And like I said, even with the multiple cuts, I'd really like to see that the one that is the first 25 minutes is the wife, and then it goes and just really blindsides you with what it is. But so, yes, hopefully I get around to that at some point. But this, I think, is how we're going to leave this. And then we're going to go right into a very classic vampire image, and it's, I guess you could say remake, but there's versions of it everywhere. You'll see. So, yeah, and then this will go for about another week and a half, and then that'll be it. So, yeah, so until all that, that's it.